Everything began the night the wind stopped, and the stars began to whisper. Thomas Whitfield had lived his entire 53 years within a 30-mile radius of Crestwood, Nebraska. His hands knew the texture of soil better than they knew the touch of another human being. His wife had passed 7 years prior, taken by cancer that moved through her body like a thief in the night. His daughter had moved to Denver and called once a month, her voice always hurried, always apologetic. The farm that had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that, stretched across 200 acres of wheat and soybean fields that rolled like frozen waves under the enormous Midwestern sky. He was not a particularly religious man, though he attended the Methodist Church on Easter and Christmas, standing in the back row and leaving before the final hymn. Faith for Thomas had become something like an old photograph, faded, distant, belonging to a version of himself he could no longer quite remember. When his wife died, he had stopped asking God why. The silence that followed his prayers had taught him that some questions dissolve not into answers, but into acceptance. It was late September when the world began to feel different. The harvest was nearly complete, and Thomas found himself working later into the evenings, operating the combine under floodlights that carved golden corridors through the darkness. The rhythm of the machine was meditative, the mechanical churn, the grain cascading into the hopper, the endless rows disappearing beneath the header. He had always felt most himself in these moments, alone with the land and the night, part of something larger than his own small grief. But on this particular evening, as the sun collapsed into the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, something shifted. The air grew still, not merely calm, but utterly motionless, as though the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. The usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds fell silent. Even the distant highway, normally a faint murmur of civilization, seemed to vanish into nothingness. Thomas cut the engine and climbed down from the combine. The silence pressed against his ears like water. He stood in the stubbled field, surrounded by the shadowy mountains of harvested grain, and felt for the first time in years a sensation he had almost forgotten, the electric tingle of being watched. The sky above him had deepened to indigo, and the stars were emerging one by one, unusually bright, pulsing with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate. He had seen the night sky thousands of times, had studied its constellations during countless sleepless nights after his wife's death, but tonight it looked different. The stars seemed closer, more aware, as though they were not distant suns, but eyes opening after an ancient sleep. Then he saw the light. It appeared at first as a single point of luminescence near the horizon, hovering just above the tree line that marked the western edge of his property. It was not the harsh white of an airplane or the red blink of a radio tower. This light was soft, almost liquid, shifting between shades of blue and silver like moonlight reflecting on water. It did not move in any mechanical way. Instead, it seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that felt disturbingly organic. Thomas stood frozen, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He told himself it was a drone, or perhaps some new kind of military aircraft from the Air Force Base 2 counties over. But even as these rational explanations formed in his mind, they crumbled beneath the weight of what he was witnessing. The light began to move toward him, gliding across the field with impossible smoothness, never wavering, never accelerating, maintaining a steady, purposeful approach. He should have run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee to the farmhouse, to lock the doors, to hide beneath something solid and familiar. But his legs would not obey. His body had become a statue, rooted to the earth by a force he could not name. The light drew closer, and he realized it was not a single source, but rather a sphere of illumination, containing something within it. A shape, a presence, a being. When it was perhaps 20 feet away, the light settled gently to the ground. The sphere pulsed once, twice, and then slowly began to fade, revealing what had been concealed within. The figure that stood before him was humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with limbs that were slightly too long, joints that bent at angles that defied human anatomy. Its skin, if it could be called skin, seemed to shimmer with a faint iridescence, like oil on water. But it was the face that held Thomas captive. The features were smooth, almost featureless, with eyes that were large and dark, not threatening but infinitely deep, like wells that descended into forever. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His throat had become a desert. The being did not move closer. It simply stood there, patient and still, and Thomas understood somehow that it was waiting for his fear to subside, waiting for the shock to transform into something else. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was only seconds. Time had become elastic, unreliable. Gradually, Thomas felt the terror begin to drain from his body, replaced by something unexpected, curiosity, and beneath that, something even stranger, a sense of recognition, as though he were looking at something he had always known existed but had never expected to encounter. The being raised one elongated hand, palm outward, in a gesture that was almost universally understood. Peace, no harm. Then, without the creature moving its mouth or making any audible sound, Thomas heard something. Not a voice exactly, but a sensation that translated into meaning inside his mind. It was like remembering something he had never learned, understanding a language he had never studied. "We have been watching you." The words, or the feeling of words, carried no threat. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered with a gentleness that made Thomas's eyes suddenly sting with unexpected tears. Why, Thomas thought, not knowing if the being could hear his unspoken question. The creature tilted its head, a gesture so human it was almost comical. Then the presence in Thomas's mind expanded, and he was shown something, not with images or words, but with pure comprehension that bypassed the need for translation. He understood that this being, and others like it, had been observing humanity for countless generations. Not as scientists studying insects, but as caretakers watching over something precious and fragile. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the slow evolution of human consciousness, the gradual awakening of something divine within the species. They were not gods themselves, but servants of something greater, messengers, guides, witnesses to a cosmic story that humanity had always been part of, but never fully understood. "You believe you are alone," the presence communicated. "You believe the universe is empty of intelligence, empty of purpose. This belief has made you lonely. This belief has made you cruel, to each other, to your world, to yourselves." Thomas felt his knees weaken. He sank to the ground, sitting in the dirt of his field, and the being moved closer, lowering itself until it was at his level. Its proximity should have been terrifying, but instead, Thomas felt something he had not experienced since his wife's death: comfort. "What do you want from me?" Thomas thought desperately. "I'm nobody, I'm just a farmer, I don't matter." The creature's dark eyes seemed to shimmer with something that might have been compassion. "You matter because you exist," it conveyed. "Every consciousness matters. Every soul is a note in a symphony so vast that even we cannot hear all of it. You have been chosen not because you are special, but because you are ready." Ready for what? The being was silent for a long moment, and Thomas could feel it considering how to answer, how to translate concepts that existed beyond human language into something his mind could grasp without shattering. "A change is coming," it finally communicated. "Not an ending, but a transformation. Your species stands at a threshold. Some will cross, others will not. The one you called Jesus, the teacher, the light-bearer, he was not what you have been told. He was not the only one. He was the first of many, the prototype of what your species can become. He showed you that the physical form is not the limit of consciousness, that love is not an emotion, but a fundamental force, that death is not an end, but a doorway." Thomas's mind reeled. He had grown up hearing about Jesus in Sunday school, had sung hymns about salvation and resurrection, had recited prayers promising eternal life. But this was something different. This was not about punishment and reward, heaven and hell, chosen and damned. This was about evolution, about humanity reaching a point where it could shed its caterpillar form and discover wings it never knew it possessed. The rapture, Thomas thought suddenly, the word rising from some buried memory of his grandmother's fervent prayers. "Is that what you're talking about?" The being's response felt like a smile, though its features did not change. "Your word, not ours, but yes, in a way. A moment when those who have cultivated consciousness, who have learned to love truly, who have shed the small self and discovered the greater self, they will ascend, not to some distant heaven, but to a higher frequency of existence. They will become what your teacher became, what we became long ago, what all conscious beings are meant to become." "When?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. "Soon. In your measure of time, very soon. The signs are already present. Your world is in upheaval, not because God is punishing you, but because transformation is always uncomfortable. Birth always involves pain. The old must break apart, so the new can emerge." Thomas sat in the dirt, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was being told. Around them, the night remained eerily silent, as though the entire world were listening to this conversation. "Why me?" he asked again. "Why tell me this?" "Because you have suffered," the being replied. "Because you have known loss. Because your heart, though scarred, remains open. Those who have never faced darkness cannot fully appreciate light. Those who have never grieved cannot fully comprehend joy. You are a witness. You are a seed. What we plant in you tonight will grow, and others will taste its fruit, even if they never know where it came from." The being rose to its full height, and Thomas struggled to his feet as well, his legs shaking. The creature reached out one long-fingered hand and placed it gently on Thomas's chest, directly over his heart. The touch was cool but not cold, solid but somehow also translucent, as though the being existed in multiple states simultaneously. A wave of sensation flooded through Thomas, not painful but intense beyond description. He saw flashes of his life, his wife's smile on their wedding day, his daughter's first steps, his father teaching him to drive the tractor, his mother singing in the kitchen. But he also saw beyond his life, moments from the lives of strangers, glimpses of suffering and joy, birth and death, all of it connected in an infinite web of cause and effect, action and consequence, love given and received. And beneath it all, through it all, he felt something vast and aware, a presence that was not the being before him, but something incomprehensibly larger. It was what people called God, but it was also what others called the universe, consciousness, the source, the Tao, Brahman, the All. Names were irrelevant. What mattered was the overwhelming sensation of being held, of being known completely, of being loved without condition or limit. Tears streamed down Thomas's face. His body shook with sobs that came from some deep place he had kept locked for 7 years. The grief he had never fully processed, the loneliness he had accepted as permanent, the quiet desperation that had become his constant companion, all of it rose to the surface and poured out of him. The being held its hand against his chest until the storm passed, patient as stone, present as breath. When Thomas finally quieted, when he had cried himself empty, the creature slowly withdrew its hand. The night around them began to change. The crickets resumed their chirping. A breeze whispered through the wheat stubble. In the distance, a dog barked. Reality was returning, the ordinary world reasserting itself. "Will I see you again?" Thomas thought, suddenly terrified of being alone with what he had learned. "You will never be alone again," the being assured him. "We are always watching, always waiting, always loving. When your time comes to cross the threshold, we will be there to guide you. Until then, live, love, be kind. Remember that every person you encounter is walking toward the same destination, even if they do not yet know it." The sphere of light began to form around the being once more, soft and luminous, gradually obscuring the figure within. Thomas watched, his face still wet with tears, as the light rose slowly into the air. It hovered for a moment directly above him, and he felt a final communication, wordless but clear as a bell. Tell them, or don't. Some truths cannot be taught, only discovered. But carry this knowing in your heart. Let it change you. Let it make you gentler, braver, more present. That is how the kingdom comes, not through cataclysm, but through countless small transformations, one human heart at a time. Then the light shot upward, accelerating so rapidly it seemed to simply vanish, leaving behind only the ordinary night sky, filled with ordinary stars. Thomas stood alone in his field, his legs unsteady, his mind reeling. He looked at his hands, half expecting them to be glowing or transfigured somehow. But they were just his hands, calloused, dirt-stained, marked by decades of labor. He looked at the combine, silent and hulking in the darkness. He looked at his farmhouse, its porch light a small yellow beacon in the distance. Everything looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. He walked slowly back across the field, his boots crunching on the stubble. Each step felt significant, as though he were learning to walk for the first time. The air smelled sweeter, the stars seemed brighter, his own heartbeat sounded like music. When he reached the house, he stood on the porch for a long moment before going inside. He looked up at the sky one more time, searching for any sign of the light, but saw only the familiar constellations. Orion, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia, the same stars he had looked at his entire life, now infused with new meaning. Inside, he moved through the familiar rooms like a stranger, the kitchen where his wife had baked bread, the living room where his daughter had played with dolls, the bedroom where he slept alone, surrounded by silence. Everything looked different now, backlit by the knowledge that none of it was permanent, that all of it was sacred, that the ordinary was itself miraculous. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, watching the darkness gradually give way to dawn, and thought about what he had been told. A transformation was coming. Some would ascend, others would not. It was not about being chosen by an arbitrary God, but about becoming ready, about evolving beyond the limitations of fear and separation, about learning to love the way Jesus had loved, completely, unconditionally, without reservation. He thought about his wife, and for the first time since her death, he did not feel only grief. He felt gratitude for the years they had shared, hope that she had already crossed the threshold he was only now learning about, faith that they would meet again in some form beyond his current comprehension. He thought about his daughter, busy with her life in the city, and resolved to call her not once a month but once a week, to tell her he loved her, to be present in her life, even from a distance. He thought about his neighbors, the people at church, the cashier at the feed store, all of them moving through their lives unaware that they were participants in something cosmic and profound. He wanted to grab them by the shoulders and shake them awake, to tell them what he had seen and heard and felt. But he knew with a certainty that came from some newly awakened part of himself that they would not understand. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. As the sun rose, painting the fields in shades of gold and green, Thomas made a decision. He would not speak of this to anyone. He would not try to convince or convert or proselytize. Instead, he would simply live differently. He would be kinder to the waitress at the diner who always looked tired. He would forgive his brother for the old argument that had kept them estranged for 5 years. He would donate more to the food bank. He would smile more. He would notice the small miracles, the way light moved through leaves, the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of water, the feeling of breath entering his lungs. He would become a living testament to what he had learned, even if no one ever knew why he had changed. The days that followed were strange. Thomas moved through his routines, harvesting the remaining fields, maintaining the machinery, preparing the farm for winter, but everything felt different. He noticed things he had overlooked for years: the way spiderwebs caught the morning dew and transformed into jeweled nets, the complex society of birds that lived in the oak tree by the barn, the subtle variations in the color of soil across different parts of his land. He began talking to people more, really listening when they spoke instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk. The woman at the post office mentioned her arthritis was bothering her, and Thomas found himself genuinely concerned, asking follow-up questions, offering to carry her packages. The teenage boy who helped him repair fence posts talked about feeling lost and purposeless, and Thomas sat with him during lunch break and shared stories about his own confusion at that age, offering not advice, but simply presence. People noticed. Of course they noticed. In a small town, any deviation from established patterns draws attention. The Methodist pastor stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the church's Thanksgiving dinner, but really to inquire whether Thomas was all right. There was something different about him, the pastor said carefully, something softer, more at peace. Thomas smiled and offered coffee and deflected the concern with practiced ease. He was fine, he said, better than fine, just getting older and realizing what mattered. The pastor seemed satisfied, though his eyes remained curious. In truth, Thomas was struggling. The encounter had opened something in him, a door he had not known existed, and he did not know how to close it, or if he even wanted to. He began having vivid dreams, not of the being he had met, but of his wife. She appeared young and radiant, glowing with an inner light that made his heart ache. In these dreams, she told him she was waiting for him, but not yet. There was still work to do. There were still people who needed the kindness only he could offer. There were still small acts of love that would ripple outward in ways he would never see or understand. He woke from these dreams feeling both comforted and lonely, touched by grace and burdened by responsibility. October turned to November. The fields lay bare under cold skies. Thomas attended the church's Thanksgiving dinner and found himself surrounded by his community, people he had known his entire life, but had somehow never truly seen. He looked at their faces and wondered which of them would ascend when the transformation came, which of them had already begun the inner work of becoming something more than what they currently were. He wondered if he would ascend, or if his purpose was simply to plant seeds in others, to be a catalyst for change he himself would not experience. The uncertainty should have troubled him, but it did not. He had learned, In that moment when the being touched his chest, that fear and love could not coexist in the same space. Fear required certainty about the future. Love required trust in something greater than the self. He chose love. Every day, he chose love. As November deepened and the first snow began to fall, Thomas noticed something unusual. His hands, which had begun to develop arthritis the year before, no longer ached. The persistent cough he had suffered from every winter for a decade had simply vanished. He felt stronger, more energetic, as though years were falling away from him instead of accumulating. He mentioned none of this to anyone, but he understood what was happening. The being's touch had changed him not just spiritually but physically. He was being healed, prepared, made ready. For what? He still did not entirely know. One evening in late November, as he sat by the window watching snow fall softly over his fields, the phone rang. It was his daughter, and her voice was panicked. She had lost her job, her boyfriend had left her. She was behind on rent and terrified of ending up homeless. Could she come home for a while? Just until she got back on her feet, Thomas felt his heart expand with a joy so pure it brought tears to his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Yes, of course. Come home. Stay as long as you need. Forever, if you want." When she arrived 3 days later, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing the expression of someone who had been defeated by life, Thomas met her at the door and pulled her into a hug that lasted for minutes. She sobbed against his shoulder, and he held her, stroking her hair the way he had when she was small, whispering that everything would be all right, that she was loved, that she had always been loved. Over the following weeks, as she settled into her old room and began to slowly heal from her wounds, Thomas saw her transformation. She began taking walks around the farm, noticing things she had ignored during her childhood. She helped with small chores, rediscovering the satisfaction of physical work. She talked more, opening up about her fears and regrets, and Thomas listened with the patience the being had shown him. He did not tell her about the encounter, but she felt its effects, absorbed its lessons secondhand. One morning she told him he seemed different, more present, more real than she remembered. He smiled and said maybe she was finally seeing him clearly. Christmas came. They decorated the tree together, listening to old records and drinking hot chocolate, and Thomas felt a contentment he had not known was possible. His daughter was home. His heart was full. The future remained uncertain, but the present was perfect. On Christmas Eve, they attended church together. The sanctuary was warm and crowded, filled with people singing hymns with varying degrees of ability and enthusiasm. The pastor spoke about the birth of Christ, about God becoming human to show humanity what it could become. Thomas listened with new ears, hearing truths beneath the familiar words. Jesus had not come to die for humanity's sins, he thought. Jesus had come to show humanity its potential, to demonstrate that love was stronger than death, that consciousness could transcend flesh, that the divine spark within each person was not metaphor, but literal truth. And now 2,000 years later, humanity stood at the same threshold Jesus had crossed. The opportunity was being offered again, not just to a single individual, but to the entire species. Those who were ready would rise. Those who had learned to love truly, to shed ego, to embrace compassion, they would discover they had wings. After the service, as people milled about drinking punch and eating cookies, an elderly woman approached Thomas. She was new to the area, had moved to Crestwood to be near her son after her husband's death. She looked lost among the cheerful crowd, her eyes carrying the weight of fresh grief. Thomas introduced himself and his daughter, asked about her life, listened to her story. She spoke about her late husband, about the emptiness of her days, about feeling disconnected from God despite spending her entire life in church. Where was God, she asked quietly, when her husband was dying? Why had her prayers gone unanswered? Thomas looked at her for a long moment, seeing in her eyes the same desperate loneliness he had carried for 7 years. And in that moment, without planning or conscious decision, he reached out and took her hand. God is here, he said simply, in this moment, in this connection, in the fact that you are still capable of loving someone you have lost. Death is not the end. It's a doorway. Your husband walked through it ahead of you, but you will follow when your time comes. And in the meantime, your job is to live fully, to love completely, to be present for those who still walk beside you. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand and whispered thank you, and Thomas saw something shift in her expression, the first glimmer of peace breaking through the clouds of grief. As they drove home through the snowy night, his daughter said, "That was beautiful what you told that woman. Where did that come from?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, navigating the dark country roads with practiced ease. "Sometimes," he said finally, "we learn things not by being taught but by being broken open. Pain can make us bitter, or it can make us wise. The choice is ours." His daughter nodded, understanding more than he said. That night, Thomas stood on his porch, looking up at the stars. The sky was clear and cold, and the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. He thought about the being, wondered if it was out there watching, wondered if it could feel his gratitude. "Thank you," he thought, sending the words upward like a prayer. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for the burden and the gift." No answer came, but he felt deep in his chest where the being had touched him, a warmth that might have been acknowledgement. The winter that followed was unlike any Thomas had known. The snow fell deeper than usual, blanketing the fields in silence so complete it felt sacred. His daughter remained at the farm, and together they settled into a rhythm that felt less like cohabitation and more like healing. She took a remote job that allowed her to work from the farmhouse, and in the evenings they would cook dinner together, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the bridge that distance and grief had nearly destroyed. Thomas noticed changes in himself that went beyond the physical healing. His perception had sharpened, become more acute. He could look at a person and sense the weight they carried, the hidden sorrows they concealed behind polite smiles. Walking through the grocery store became an exercise in compassion. Every face he passed told a story of struggle and hope, fear and resilience. He began to understand what the being had meant about every soul being a note in a vast symphony. Each person was playing their part, even when they played it badly, even when they were out of tune. The music was larger than any individual performance. January brought bitter cold and long nights. Thomas found himself waking at odd hours, drawn to the window, staring out at the frozen landscape bathed in moonlight. On one such night, around 3 in the morning, he saw something that made his breath catch. Lights in the sky. Not one, but dozens. Small points of luminescence moving in patterns that were clearly not random, not natural. They danced and wove through the darkness like fireflies, performing an elaborate choreography. He watched for nearly an hour, transfixed, until they gradually faded and disappeared. He said nothing to his daughter about what he had seen, but he knew. They were watching. They had always been watching, and the time was drawing closer. In February, something happened that he could not explain away or rationalize. Old Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 miles down the road, had been battling lung cancer for 2 years. The entire community knew she was dying. It was simply a matter of when. Thomas had visited her several times over the winter, bringing food his daughter had prepared, sitting beside her bed and listening to her stories about the old days when Crestwood had been a thriving railroad town. On a particularly cold Tuesday afternoon, he stopped by with a pot of soup. Mrs. Patterson looked worse than he had ever seen her, grey-skinned, skeletal, barely conscious. Her daughter, who had moved home to care for her, met Thomas at the door with red-rimmed eyes. "She's not eating anymore," the daughter whispered. "The hospice nurse says it's just a matter of days now, maybe hours." Thomas asked if he could sit with her for a while. The daughter nodded gratefully and left to run errands, desperate for a break from the death watch. Thomas sat in the chair beside Mrs. Patterson's bed, holding her papery hand. Her breathing was labored, rattling in her chest with each inhalation. She was so far gone, she probably did not even know he was there. But he felt compelled to speak anyway. "Mrs. Patterson," he said softly, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that what's coming next isn't the end. It's a beginning. You're going to step through a doorway, and on the other side, there's no more pain, no more fear, just light and love and the people who went before you, waiting to welcome you home." As he spoke, something strange happened. The room seemed to grow warmer, brighter, though no lights had been turned on. Thomas felt a tingling in his hand, the one holding Mrs. Patterson's, and suddenly he was overwhelmed by the same sensation he had experienced when the being touched his chest. Energy flowed through him, not from him but through him, as though he were merely a conduit for something vast and healing. Mrs. Patterson's eyes fluttered open. They were clear, lucid, more alive than they had been in months. She looked at Thomas and smiled. "I see them," she whispered. "My husband, my parents. They're here, they're waiting." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Then go to them, it's okay, you can let go." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength, took one more breath, smooth and easy, without pain, and then was gone. The struggle left her face. She looked peaceful, almost young, as though decades had fallen away in that final moment. Thomas sat with her body for a long time, feeling the room slowly return to normal temperature, normal light. When Mrs. Patterson's daughter returned and found her mother dead, she wept with relief as much as grief. The doctor who came to sign the death certificate remarked on how peaceful she looked, how unusual it was for someone with such advanced disease to die with such serenity. Thomas said nothing about what had happened, but he knew he had been used as an instrument. Whatever had touched him that night in the field had left a mark, a capability, a gift. He was becoming something more than what he had been, preparing for the transformation that was coming not just for him, but for all of humanity. Word spread quickly through the small community about Mrs. Patterson's peaceful death and Thomas's presence at her bedside. Within a week, he received calls from 3 other families asking if he would visit their dying relatives. He did not know how to refuse, could not refuse, and so he went. Each time was the same. He would sit beside the dying person, hold their hand, speak softly about the doorway that awaited them, and each time that strange warmth would fill the room, that energy would flow through him, and the person would slip away peacefully, often speaking about seeing loved ones who had gone before. His daughter noticed the change in him, the way people had started looking at him with a mixture of reverence and unease. "Dad," she said one evening after he returned from another deathbed vigil, "what's happening to you? People are talking. They're saying you have some kind of gift." Thomas sat at the kitchen table, exhausted, but filled with a peace that went beyond understanding. "I don't have a gift," he said carefully. "I'm just a doorway, a bridge. I'm helping people see that death isn't what we've been taught it is. It's not an ending. It's a homecoming." She studied his face for a long moment. "So you believe that? Really believe it? Since when did you become so spiritual? You barely went to church before Mom died, and after she died, you stopped completely." "I had an experience," Thomas said, choosing his words with care. "Something that showed me the universe is not what I thought it was, that we're not alone, that there's something vast and loving holding all of this together, and death is just a transition, a doorway from one room to another." "What kind of experience?" He looked at his daughter, at her skeptical but curious expression, and made a decision. Not to tell her everything, some things could not be translated into words, but to tell her enough. "I met someone," he said. "Something. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't cruel or frightening either. It told me that a change is coming, a transformation, that humanity is about to take a step forward in its evolution, and some people are ready for it while others aren't, and that the ones who are ready will ascend, like Jesus did, like the rapture the old preachers used to talk about, except it's not about being chosen by an angry God. It's about becoming ready, about learning to love the way we were always meant to love." He expected her to laugh, to dismiss him as delusional or suffering from grief-induced fantasy, but she did not. She sat very still, her eyes wide, and finally said, "Do you think I'm ready?" The question broke his heart. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think readiness isn't something you achieve through perfection. It's something you approach through willingness, through staying open even when life hurts, through choosing love even when fear feels safer." She was quiet for a long time, processing. Finally she said, "I'm scared." "Me too," Thomas admitted, "but I'm also hopeful. Whatever's coming, it's not punishment, it's possibility." Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. The fields that had lain dormant all winter began to show the first green shoots of new life. Thomas prepared for planting, but his heart was not fully in the work. He felt increasingly like a man standing on a train platform, waiting for a departure he knew was imminent, but could not schedule. The dreams intensified. He saw cities of light, structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, beings of pure consciousness that had long ago transcended the need for physical form. He saw Earth from space, beautiful and fragile, surrounded by what he could only describe as a web of light, connections between all living things, all souls, all consciousness, and he saw that web beginning to pulse with greater intensity, as though it were preparing to transmit some enormous signal. The being appeared to him twice more during those spring months, not physically, but in visions that were as real as waking life. Each time, it reinforced the message. The transformation was coming. Those who had learned to love, to forgive, to shed ego and embrace unity, they would rise, not to some distant heaven, but to a higher frequency of existence where suffering was impossible because separation was revealed as illusion. "What about the ones who don't rise?" Thomas asked during the second vision. "What happens to them?" The being's response was tinged with something that felt like sadness. "They will have other chances. Evolution is not a single event, but a process. This transformation will happen again and again in cycles spanning millennia. Eventually, all consciousness will ascend. But timing is individual. Some souls need more experiences, more lessons, more opportunities to choose love over fear. How will I know when it's time? You will know. Everyone who is ready will know. It will feel like remembering something you have always known, like coming home after a long journey, and it will be beautiful beyond description." Thomas woke from that vision to find his daughter standing in his bedroom doorway, her face pale. "I heard you talking," she said, "but there's no one here. Who were you speaking to?" "The future," Thomas said, "or the past, or both. Time doesn't work the way we think it does." She climbed into bed beside him, curling up against his shoulder the way she had as a child during thunderstorms. "I'm scared, Dad. Something feels different. The world feels different, like the air before a storm." "I know," he said, holding her, "but remember, a storm clears the air. It washes things clean. What comes after is always better than what came before." In May, something happened that made national news. All around the world, people began reporting strange phenomena. Lights in the sky appearing simultaneously in dozens of locations. Crop circles of such geometric complexity that mathematicians could not explain them. Mass meditations, where thousands of people reported experiencing the same vision, a being of light telling them to prepare, to open their hearts, to release fear. The internet exploded with theories. Alien invasion, government conspiracy, mass hallucination, the return of Christ, the end times. Churches filled with frightened believers seeking reassurance. Scientists appeared on television offering rational explanations that satisfied no one. Governments issued statements urging calm while quietly mobilizing military forces. But Thomas knew what was happening. The veil was thinning, the frequency was rising, the moment was approaching. His phone rang constantly, people asking if he had seen the lights, if he knew what was happening, if the end of the world was coming. He told them what he could without revealing too much. No, it was not the end. It was a beginning, a transformation, and fear would not help them prepare. On a warm evening in late May, Thomas and his daughter sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was thick with the scent of growing things, of earth warming under the sun, of life renewing itself. "It's happening soon, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Will we be together?" Thomas took her hand. "I don't know, but I believe that love transcends all boundaries, time, space, even death. If we're separated physically, we'll still be connected spiritually, and that connection can never be broken." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad I came home. I'm glad we had this time." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That night, Thomas did not sleep. He sat by the window, watching the stars, feeling the weight of anticipation growing in his chest. Around midnight, the air changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, though it was the end of May. The sounds of night creatures, frogs, crickets, owls, fell silent. He knew. This was it. He woke his daughter gently. "Come outside," he said. "You need to see this." They stood together in the front yard, looking up. The sky was alive with light, not the lights of spacecraft, but something far more profound. The stars themselves seemed to be growing brighter, pulsing in rhythm, and between them curtains of luminescence rippled like aurora borealis on a cosmic scale. All around the world, Thomas knew, people were witnessing the same thing, the prepared and the unprepared, the faithful and the skeptical, the loving and the fearful, all of them watching as the universe revealed its true nature. Then he felt it, the sensation beginning in his chest where the being had touched him months before. A warmth that spread through his entire body, not painful but intense, restructuring him at a cellular level. He looked down at his hands and saw them beginning to glow with the same soft luminescence that had surrounded the being. His daughter gasped. She was glowing too, her face radiant, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, "I feel it. I feel everything. Everyone. We're all connected. We've always been connected." "Yes," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're all one consciousness experiencing itself from different perspectives. We're all God awakening to its own nature. Around them, Though they could not see it from their isolated farm, millions of people were experiencing the same transformation. Not everyone, perhaps only a fraction of humanity, but enough to change everything. Thomas felt his body becoming lighter, less solid, as though gravity itself were releasing its hold. He looked at his daughter and saw that she was beginning to rise, her feet lifting gently from the ground. Fear flashed across her face, but he smiled at her, reassuring. "It's okay," he said. "This is what we've been waiting for. Don't be afraid." They rose together, hand in hand, their physical forms dissolving into light while their consciousness expanded beyond anything they had known. Thomas felt his awareness stretching outward, connecting with every ascending soul, and through them to the vast web of consciousness that was the universe itself. He saw his wife, radiant and whole, waiting for him with open arms. He saw his parents, his grandparents, generations of ancestors who had already made this transition. He saw the being who had visited him, and understood now that it had once been human too, had once stood where he stood, had once made this same journey. And beyond all of this, he felt the presence he had touched briefly, when the being placed its hand on his chest, the vast, loving intelligence that held all things in existence. Not a being separate from creation, but the consciousness within all things, waking up to itself through countless individual awakenings. Below them on earth, those who had not ascended watched in awe and terror as millions of people simply vanished in cascades of light. Some understood what they were witnessing, others did not, but all were changed by it. The world would never be the same. Those who remained would have to build new societies, new ways of living, new understanding of what humanity was and could become. Some would do so with wisdom and compassion, guided by the memory of those who had ascended. Others would cling to old patterns of fear and division. But the door had been opened, the possibility had been demonstrated, and in future generations there would be another rising and another, until eventually all of consciousness evolved beyond the limitations of physical form. Thomas's last thought before his individual identity dissolved into the greater whole was of gratitude. Gratitude for his life, for his losses, for his daughter, for the stranger who had revealed the truth to him on that autumn night. Gratitude for the long road of suffering that had prepared him to receive joy. Gratitude for being part of something so vast and beautiful that even glimpsing a fragment of it was enough to justify every moment of pain. And then he was not Thomas anymore. He was light. He was love. He was home. On the abandoned farm in Nebraska, the wheat still grew in its rows. The house stood empty. But in the living room, on the mantel above the fireplace, a photograph remained. Thomas and his daughter taken on Christmas Eve, both of them smiling, both of them glowing with something the camera could not quite capture, but preserved nonetheless. A week after the event that the news called simply the vanishing, a neighbor came to check on the property. He found everything undisturbed, peaceful, as though the occupants had simply stepped out for a walk and would return at any moment. In the fields, the wheat had grown unusually tall, and when the wind blew through it, it made a sound like singing. Perhaps the stranger was a wanderer from distant stars. Perhaps he was a projection of something within the man himself, the divine spark recognizing its own reflection. Perhaps the entire story is metaphor for something that cannot be spoken directly, only approached through symbol and narrative, truth or fiction. Maybe even the teller of this tale does not know. Here stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.